Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the third day of the Victoria PTG. Um, as usual, we'll be using the Etherpad to do stuff, so please open one. If I forgot to mention this yesterday, um, if you haven't already, please scroll up to the top and add yourself to the attendees so we can sort of keep track of who's been here. Um, okay. What I'd like to do is give anyone a chance to follow up on anything from yesterday, any second thoughts or items that we missed that we should bring up. So let me stop for a second and shut up and let people have an opportunity to talk. Okay, and the silence is deafening, so I guess we're okay. Um, so one thing I do want to do a retrospective that will hopefully be a little bit more lively than yesterday's. So there's a form with some questions if you want to fill it out. Otherwise, you can just open it during the retrospective and it may prompt some thoughts. The other thing is I'm thinking of moving to MeetPad or so what I think BlueJeans is great for recording. MeetPad wasn't, but I liked when we had a meeting in MeetPad, we were able to see like a lot more people at once than you can see in BlueJeans. So I'd like to switch to that for the happy hour since we're not going to record that anyway. So just as a heads up, that seems to work at least in Fedora 32. My experience has been you just open it in the browser and everything works great. Um, so possibly
Yeah, I was on a
that's
few of
true.
them yesterday and they were all good.
Okay, so I think it'll be a really easy transition and we can just put the information on the Etherpad and I'll leave my computer connected to BlueJeans. So if anybody shows up late, they'll know where to go. So I think we'll be okay for that. And then we'll see um, how that goes. Okay, so I added a new topic since yesterday here about security issues. Just want to discuss a few things real quickly. So you may have noticed an email to the mailing list. There's a link on the Etherpad that came out right after our sessions yesterday that we've issued a OpenStack security note for Cinder, um, number 86, and we also had 85. Um, that has to do with one of the backend drivers. Um, so feel free to, you don't have to do this now, but you can look at the OSSN. Um, it's a similar issue to the one that we had in 85, except the issue in OSSN 85 was a bit more constrained because it wasn't a default. You needed to use a non-default setting if you were using the Ceph backend to have the issue occur. With this one, it was just the regular driver functioning where the issue occurred. Now, I'm bringing it up because it would probably be a good idea for all driver developers to look through these and then make sure your driver's not subject to something like this. Um, because, right, all the drivers offer different connection info so that you can actually attach stuff. And it'd be worth doing a quick review to make sure you're not leaking anything that would be hazardous. And then if you are, file a private bug, please, and we'll figure out how to handle that. Um, so this was 86 was particularly complicated because it required changes to Brick and to Cinder. And so we got all the Brick patches merged yesterday. So that's good. We got all the Brick releases made yesterday. And then we're currently, let's see, after the releases are made, then there has to be an update to upper constraints before we can actually consume the new Brick library with Cinder so that we can do new releases of Cinder. There was a holdup in master that Sham was able to fix. Um, and wait, I had a particular point I wanted to make about that, and I'm losing track. But anyway, so the problem was we switched from retrying to tenacity because retrying has become unmaintained. And those changes work great in Brick and they work great in Cinder. But when you put the two together, we wound up breaking the Cinder unit tests. And so we couldn't get that through the upper constraints. John was able to trace down what's happening. And it looks like there's been a change made in tenacity that's going to allow us to do our testing. It didn't have anything to do with the actual patch. It was more to do with tests. And it was basically in order to do some of the unit testing we wanted to do in both Brick and Cinder, we were monkey patching tenacity, which is fine individually, but when we're using Brick, tenacity's already been imported and we're too late to make our changes to it, and that was causing our unit tests to fail. Anyway, that's been figured out, and we're not going to release from Cinder from Victoria anyway, so I guess that doesn't really matter. But it did bring up, I think Eric maybe mentioned something at the last Cinder meeting that, we really should have some kind of test to compare, to be running any changes that have been made to Brick with current Cinder to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen. And I had taken the action item to do that, but haven't done it yet. And this indicates that it's like way more, that it's very important. At least it would have been very convenient to have known in advance that this was going to fail. Okay, so the current status is the Cinder patches are all, I believe, unmerged. So this is a link to, I just posted in Etherpad, to the Cinder patches. So I need stable cores to take a look at these. Master has to wait. Everything else, I believe, has been updated. I think Stein and Train are in the gate now because I had to update the requirements files. So those are waiting. Ussuri's ready to go, and so are Queens and Rocky. But if you could, so with Queens and Rocky, there's no release notes because we're not going to be doing any releases. But I updated the commit message to tell operators what they have to do if they want to apply the Cinder patch. So please look at that because I don't think we can, this is sort of like our only chance to put that into the commit message because you can't, I don't think you can update the commit message once it's been merged into, yeah, anyway. So please look at those when you have a chance. But I think we're in pretty good shape otherwise for getting the things merged and new Cinder releases cut. So yeah, so Train and Stein by happy hour should be ready for reviews. Ussuri, Rocky, and Queens are ready for reviews. So please take a look when you get a chance. But for people who aren't on the stable core team, please take a look at your drivers and assess whether they might be vulnerable to some kind of similar failure, because we've had 2 cycles in a row now. That's always not nice. Okay. Any comments or anything? Great. Okay. So anyway, I've been obsessed with that, and hopefully this will be out of my life very soon, and I can move on to other stuff. Okay. So today's about Cinder improvements. Eric has volunteered to talk about some things about reviewing our reviewing strategies, and then he's got a proposal that we can use type annotations to really solidify our coding in Cinder and make things easier to review. So looking forward to that too. So that being said, I'm going to shut up and let Eric have the floor. Eric, do you need to share the screen?
Yes.
I think I should stop the other one, right? So that you can do yours. That would make the most sense. Okay, I'll do that.
All right. So as far as reviewing strategies. I really, I don't know that I'm quite living up to the title here, but I really just want to spread awareness of our coverage tools. So I put together a little thing on my recent experience with them, and here, let me share my screen. I don't know how this best works. Is this viewable? Can people see this?
Yeah,
Yep.
it looks good.
Yeah, it looks good.
I put a lot of work into my fancy graphics for this, so I have the full screen experience. So I think some discussions with Brian recently were leading me to the impression that a lot of people maybe aren't aware of the coverage tooling that we have for Cinder unit testing. I use this for reviewing patches in various ways. Sometimes it'll help you kind of find code that didn't get unit tested. Well, that's the main thing that it does, but that can mean a few different things. I mean, it'll help you find code that maybe needs more careful review than other pieces. It'll help find places that you want to ask for the author of whatever you're reviewing to add tests. This particular scenario that I just picked out here was one that I went through recently. So I was reviewing this, can I click on this? I don't know. Oh, God. I was reviewing this thing, which was a backport on OSBrick to Stein, and for whatever reason, I had a whim to go run a coverage test on it, which is a thing you have to go do by hand. It's not shown in the gate anywhere, which I think is okay, but that means you have to be aware to do this. So basically, you can take OSBrick or Cinder, go run tox-e cover, and it will do a unit test run on whatever the default Python 3 environment is, I think, and generate a big HTML report of coverage. So you get something, you get a cover directory in your OSBrick or Cinder directory locally that you can open index.html, and it has a whole list of all the files, and it'll give you percentages on how many lines in the files are covered and not covered. So in this case, I was looking at this method because this was, I think, find root device was a method added by this patch. And I had already seen that the submitter had written unit tests for this. But if you look at 223, 224 here, yellow means that that line was hit, but it was a conditional and it only hit like one branch of it. And then the red one means that you never hit that line at all. Which struck me as weird because there was a unit test right here that that run. I hope you guys can see my mouse cursor.
Yep, we can see it.
I have a laser pointer apparently. So there's a test right here that says run RBD connector disconnect volume, and it checks to make sure that when you did that, eventually these two commands were executed, RBD show mapped and RBD unmapped, which in this code right here is what generates the RBD show mapped command. So this looks pretty good, right? But then you're staring at this going, how is this never hit if there's a unit test written for this method, right? Well, again, because this doesn't exist, has calls, is not actually a mock method that exists. And since it's just a magic mock, you can call mock execute dot like anything, and it'll just, like, this test passes right here. Annoying. Anyway, you can call mock execute dot whatever, and the unit test will pass, because that's what mock does. The only thing that it will catch is if you write mock execute dot assert something, and since it starts with the word assert, it'll actually fail. So anyway, this was what was submitted, was mock execute has calls. This was what it was supposed to be, was assert has calls. So I tweaked the test and submitted it, and then it turned out that basically the code itself was wrong. And since the unit test was not written correctly, it didn't detect that the code was wrong until we fixed the unit test. And then the author went and fixed the actual code, which was clearly broken. But the point of all of this is that we merged this into master and merged it into train. Maybe we merged it into Ussuri. I don't remember if this was before or after we branched that. But we merged it into master and 1 or 2 stable branches. And then I ran a coverage report and found out that it was broken. The point being, coverage checking is a useful thing for code inspection, reviews, that kind of thing. So I really just wanted to make sure people know that that's a thing that you can actually do. As far as avoiding this stuff, there's a few ways to avoid it. We don't really do very well with this in Cinder code or in Cinder unit tests in general. If you mock out the execute method and provide a spec, which tells mock you're mocking out a method that is basically based on this real method, and then it will check and detect this error of calling mock execute that has calls, and it'll actually detect it and fail it. Or you can do mock auto spec true will also fail, and would have detected this broken test case. And you just get, what you would expect like that. Yeah, and as I already said, it wasn't just a test, the thing was actually broken. So I don't know, in conclusion, coverage exists, use it sometimes. It's handy for finding bugs. It's handy for also just kind of assessing risk of somebody writes a new driver. Some of them come in and have like 95% coverage. Some come in and have like 50%. It's good to kind of gauge where you're at on likelihood of bugs hiding in there. And mock is, as always, kind of hard to use. I think that's it for this one. So I guess if anybody has any other things they'd like to discuss in the area of review tricks or anything related to this, it's a great time to throw ideas out there. But
yeah, I had
I mostly wanted to
quick question about I've seen this several times and I always forget. But it seems like the default should be auto spec equals true for mock. But there are reasons not to do it, and I'm trying to remember. Well, I guess maybe the story here is we do auto spec equals true, and then you will find out in the course of your unit test if something breaks weirdly.
I have definitely investigated that same question at some point before, and I don't remember really good explanation. I think, and Gorka might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of if you use like the Cinder method, we have like a mock object method that we wrote in the Cinder unit tests, and I think it might actually do some of that for you if you use it, but I don't remember off the top of my head.
You mean the objects we have? Sorry, my mind went somewhere else. So you're asking if the two methods that we currently have in our test, which are mock and mock object, if they do the cleanup, or are you asking if they do the auto spec?
If they do any kind of auto specking.
No.
Oh, okay.
But it's easy to do.
And do we want to make our cover job voting?
Do we want to do what?
A cover job voting on gates?
No. I think that's a really, that's one of the things that sounds like a good idea, but I think in practice it's a big pain because well,
yeah, you remove code and suddenly it fails because you have to add a bunch of, because the coverage is failing. So yes,
it might be
removing code.
Yeah, it might be reasonable to use it as a some kind of guideline benchmark for people submitting new drivers, but in practice, it can take a whole ton of work to get from like 90% coverage to 100%, and honestly, it's not always even worth doing, in my opinion. So it's kind of a
yes. I'm not saying that we have to make a goal 100% coverage, but we can get the current coverage, or it's about 78%. We can say, okay, we've got 75% coverage and we shouldn't have less, so we can make a goal, make a job to check coverage and do not introduce new code without tests.
I don't think it fails based on a number. Really, all it does is run the unit tests again and then generates the HTML output. So I don't know if there's any way we could make that voting. I seem to remember we used to actually run coverage as part of normal unit tests. It is kind of useful to have handy to look at. So maybe as a non-voting job like we do with Pylint. But kind of the problem there too is we have the Pylint non-voting job, and I'm pretty sure most people don't even look at that when it fails, when it highlights issues.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess the advantage to having it as a non-voting job would just be that it's there on the review if you want to look. Whereas otherwise you'd have to, download it and then generate the coverage locally.
Just a quick note. In Sahara, we had the cover job, which was it wasn't just running the cover docs target, but it was running it against the code before the patch and after the patch, calculating the difference and fading if a certain threshold was not satisfied. So that was the kind of things you are asking for, but it's not done automatically by the cover job. You need to do some other magic. But you can steal it. It's not just Sahara. Also, other projects have that. And of course, you can change the percentages.
Yes, we've got this similar job for Horizon, but only for JavaScript tests, not for Python code yet.
So the pilot brings up a good question, because I've noticed people have been occasionally putting up patches fixing pilot problems. So it's definitely helpful to look at. I guess
I think it'd be great if we paid more attention.
Yeah, I guess maybe we can make it a, I forget the last time I looked how many things are being flagged with it. So
Right, well, in the Python job we have now is a little odd because there's some things that I don't think we can even fix. So the reason we made it non-voting and the reason why, if you look into it, it's doing some kind of weird things, is it'll actually only look at files that particular patch is modifying, and it'll run Pylint against the previous commit, and then run Pylint against the current commit, and only fail it if new warnings are introduced. I think is how we left it.
yeah, we should check that, because if that's the case, then that's actually good.
Yeah, that was actually the intent. So if it is,
Yeah.
if it's failing and it's only looking at new changes, well,
I want to say that it definitely did that at one point, and then
yeah,
the way that job runs was totally, or not the job, but the tox tooling and stuff for it was reworked, and I'm not sure if it actually still does that same thing now.
yeah. Actually, thinking about it, I think you're right. I think it does only run on the files that are modified, but it must not be doing that before and after comparison because I've seen it fail on jobs that definitely don't introduce anything that should trigger a Pylint failure. So I think it just checks the files that are modified to see if there's any Pylint issues.
Yeah, because it has, I mean, I think I put up a patch yesterday. I mean, it is kind of helpful. I mean, it's caught some stuff, in various places where there was a bug just waiting to happen that hadn't been triggered. So
I think there's also some additional work that could be done on the Pylint stuff if we wanted to. Because if I remember correctly, I think it may have the ability to teach it a little bit more about our like Cinder objects code. Because the problem with Pylint is that it's just a static parsing tool, right? And it's not really smart enough to figure out things like how Cinder objects work, which they have all this code that's in a whole bunch of different layers that dynamically builds objects. And it basically doesn't know what's going on with them.
That's right. That was the big issue.
So I think there's some ways that you can maybe help it parse that kind of stuff by adding some info somewhere, but it's been a long time since I looked at it.
So is anyone in particular interested in chasing down the Pylint stuff? I guess so. I personally think it's a useful tool. I mean, there are limitations to all this static analysis stuff, but on the other hand, it's
But
helpful.
Pylint's really useful if you are accustomed to what it will actually tell you and what you should ignore that it says and that kind of thing. Once you kind of figure out how to parse what it's telling you, it's handy. But I don't know. I mean, what would the objectives be as far as things we want to do to it for now?
Well, it'd be nice to get it to the point where, right, we could do this. If it looked at the current, we can get it green, and then it's only looking at the current change, and it goes red, then that should actually be a real indicator.
Yeah, I like that behavior. I think that was basically undone because somebody had the opinion that it took too long to run when you did it that way because it ran twice and it had complicated scripts, and I don't know. Somebody decided it needed to be restructured, and
were we running into timeout issues with that?
It could be.
I don't know, maybe.
Doesn't seem like we should. Just running unit tests twice doesn't take that long.
Yeah,
Maybe before we fix some of those issues where drivers were sleeping for 60 seconds.
Well, Pyline doesn't run the unit test. It's just scanning the code.
Oh, yeah.
Not that. It'd be something else. It did. There was a time where it had a bunch of issues, though, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we made it non-voting because we still wanted to get that output, kind of like what we were talking about with the coverage report. It's useful to have, but we didn't want it to be something that would block us and prevent getting patches through.
Okay, well, at this point, we've got it running. I guess the first step would just be, even though it's read a lot, it may be useful for the particular patch you're looking at. So please be aware that it's useful. And what about with the coverage? Do we want to add a non-voting coverage just so the stuff is there on the review? Or do we just want to tell people, go ahead and you should download the review? I mean, it kind of depends because for some...
It just depends on how often people actually want to look at it. I mean, if you put it there and nobody actually looks at it, then it's just running all the time for no reason.
We could use the file matching and have the job only run for any driver code. One idea, so that we're not running it all the time.
Right.
Or maybe have it just run when, I don't even know if you can do this, but maybe have it run when new Python files are added, as opposed to most changes, to cover new drivers and large core changes. I don't know if we have a way to filter on additional.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of with the Zool configuration.
Well, I guess we can encourage everyone to look at coverage reports. And as you do that and find them useful, somebody may be motivated to just say, let's put it in as a job so it's always available. It's not that, I mean, it does run fairly quickly locally.
So just a question. So if we made it non-voting, is the concern that it's taking up additional resources to do the coverage report?
Basically,
Yeah,
I mean, but it's not like a Tempest run. It's just a unit test run, so it's not terrible.
Because if it's something we can add as a tool, so here's my thought. People don't have a lot of time and are lazy. If the information is there, the chances that people are going to go look at it is much higher than if it isn't there. So that would be my sense.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Because that's really what I was getting at.
Because what Eric just shared, I'm like, oh, okay, that's useful. That'd be great to look at. And he's like, okay, so I downloaded it, and I did this, and I did that, and I did that. I'm like, oh, well, there went my 30 minutes of review time that I had today. So,
yeah, okay.
I like that Brian and Eric are at least laughing. So.
No, I think that's it. I mean, I don't want to encourage people not to download reviews and test them locally. But on the other hand, right, time is a limited constraint. And the one feedback we did get from drivers, a couple of people filled out the survey after the thing yesterday, is they would like faster reviews, but we'd also like them to be quality. So
right.
I think anything that contributes to that is good. So I think maybe let's add it. It's a non-voting job because we can't really figure out a way to make it a sensible voting job, but at least the stuff will be there. You can click on it and you can go look at the coverage. So the resources being used are just some time and place to put the logs, basically. But I think let's...
and hardware is cheap.
Yeah, and at least, yeah. So let's I think
I
maybe it's
don't believe that a lot of people will.
What's that?
I don't believe that people will look on non-voting coverage job.
I'm sorry, broke up again.
Yeah, he doesn't think that people will actually look at it.
Oh,
So share more why you say that, Ivan.
Excuse me?
Why do you say that?
because really we're not talking about people. We're just talking about the core reviewers at least.
Right.
They're not people.
But my experience looking to not job only if I think it you broke a patch. Usually skip non-voting other patches.
Okay. But I think some of that can be handled as a cultural change, that as we're educating new core reviewers and the review team, we say, hey, this is a tool that you should probably be making use of. Yvonne, you were breaking up with a lot of what you said, but I'm kind of guessing based on facial expression and context. Is it just me, or is he breaking up a lot?
Yeah, he's breaking up a lot.
Okay. Have I died now?
No, I can see you.
Hey, you.
Okay. Everybody was just listening to me. I'm not used to that. Lately, nobody listens, so.
So now that you're not PTL, everybody listens to you. So it's kind of a job.
Yeah. It worked for Sean.
All right. Well,
That's my 2 cents. I'll move on.
yeah, I guess so. I'm kind of in favor. Well, let's. Yes, since I'm kind of in favor, I'll look into putting the job up, and then maybe we can refine it so that it's more focused on the particular patch you're looking at. But at least having the stuff there so you can see it, I think is good. And we don't have a particular threshold that we're looking for, but it is interesting to know if the code you're looking at is actually covered by the test you're also looking at. And this, I mean, the case that Eric looked at was really interesting because it looked for sure like the tests were good and they were covering what you actually wanted to see. So I'm in favor of that. I'll action item myself to follow up on that. And I may pull Luigi in since he's our testing guru, or Zool person, I mean.
And since I didn't show this in the presentation, this is the actual index file that you get from the coverage report, if you can see this. And it's cool because you can look at things like how many lines are not covered, what's the percentage covered. Some of the 0% ones are because there's like no actual code in there. But when you look at like volume manager at 67%, that's probably not great because that's an important thing.
Eric, could you put that somewhere where we can all have a look at it?
Yeah, I don't know where that is, but yeah, I will do that later.
Thanks.
So I saw somebody put a topic in the Etherpad, but I'm going to suggest that
Yeah, Pukesh here, I did put something. I'm from Interop working group. Wanted to
so
check Cinder, do we have anything new from the release notes and the patches still submitted?
well, so I was going to say my next topic on here I think kind of flows well from what we're talking about with the topic we're finishing right now.
So we
Yeah, I
did
can answer
some.
the working group thing real fast. I think we've got nothing new for the interoperability working group. We've only made, the last couple of cycles, we only made some change to micro versions.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay, so
it's basically, so there are no major changes, is what it comes down to.
Hey, Brian, we're getting some weird feedback. Can everyone make sure they're on mute?
Prakash, can you mute? It looks like it's coming from you. Okay.
Yeah, so I was at the Interop meeting on Monday, but had to drop because I had some really bad Zoom problems. But we're basically, I'll go look at that draft again. But basically, right, V2's been deprecated for a while, so Gman's got that patch up to take care of that. And then there haven't been any major changes that would affect functionality that should either be in or out of what used to be called DevCore. So we've added some micro versions, but it's mostly filtering on responses at this point. But that's one of those things with the micro versions, you don't have to use it. So I don't know how you take those things into account, but there's nothing major.
got it. So micro versions usually we don't really worry. The only thing we worry is that a user API calling from your Rados gateway or whatever client side, and is it user API which has changed? If not, or even if it has changed, is the test created for that which runs? So all we do is plug in the test case ID from Tempest so that you have multiple tests, one may fail but one may pass, so we know which changes have actually impacted it. And plus we have some weightages and all, so as long as there is no major change, only change I remember is the Python and the dropping. I asked Ghanshyam Man to provide the deprecation, take a look at whatever they have failed. He said there is nothing seems very important. He has one patch he has submitted, which is there V3 versus V2 deprecated, because you need to have 3 prior releases, continuity of it. Otherwise, we don't change anything. In the sense that if it is Ussuri, if you have something changed in Rocky, after Rocky, if there is a change, that may be, if suppose after Rocky you came to Stein, if it is in Stein and it is still a candidate, right? It's not dropped. Like Python 2.7 to 3.56, it took 3 releases. So if you have done something 3 release back and which was V2, I believe, and that's what we have, even though we have removed from the next, but the tests still continue to be there, because if there is some dependency, we don't want to lose anyone. We may have more tests, that's all. So that's, in short, I believe we are okay, but still I just wanted to give a last try. And if you say there is nothing, then we'll just move on, get the approval from the board for the Cinder, which is part of the code.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'll just take an action item to look that over. I have looked, and I think we're okay. The only thing, I'll double check to make sure that when we drop V2 coverage, we're not losing any V3 coverage. But I think we're fine.
Okay, I think that should suffice now, and I will proceed.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I'll follow up with you on that.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Okay, thanks.
I'll drop out. Thanks.
Okay. Should go back to Eric.
Yeah, let me reload. My video quit working.
Oh, okay, sure.
All right. Am I starting the next thing?
Oh, yeah, I guess I should have indicated that. Yeah, so
Oh,
Eric's up to continue with how to be better reviewers.
no, I don't need a formal introduction. Also, that's not what this is about.
Okay.
So, yeah, all right. So I got another presentation thing about type annotation, type hinting. Let's see, share screen. Right. All right. Can you see this?
Yeah, looks good.
All right.
Yep.
So on the theme, which is shifting from reviews to making code better, want to kind of give an intro to type annotations or type hinting in Python. This is something that's been a long time coming in the Python world that we can start taking advantage of now, and I'm pretty interested in it. So I'll go over what it is and what's going on here. So the thing about Python, the dynamically typed language, it's real easy to just write code, but it's real easy to write code that doesn't work and not know that. And the idea is that this will help find bad code other than by running Tempest or inflicting it on users. So we kind of have a hierarchy currently of places you can find that your code is bad. Unit test is probably before reviews, but this is the kind of general idea. And so the goal is to have something similar to unit tests, but have another spot to shake out issues in the code, basically. The static analysis, as we kind of mentioned in discussing Highland, is basically just the general area of scanning code and detecting errors in it, as opposed to running it to detect errors like you would do with unit tests. Those of you who, before OpenStack, spent time writing C, C++, those kinds of things, if you're like me, you probably miss having a compiler that yells at you and tells you that something is wrong, which Python does not do very often. But we can help it do that with type annotations and some new tooling to use those annotations. and I'll have examples of how this works. Is a lot of what this is about. But type hints, type annotations. The whole concept here is you want to add information to the code so that a person, or hopefully a tool that you run against the code reading it, actually can identify types of variables, parameters to methods, return values of methods, as opposed to the kind of default state of Python for a long time, which is pretty much you have an object and you can do stuff with it and just try to not do the wrong thing with it. So the way that this works, we look at, I kind of picked snippets out of Cinder that hopefully people might be vaguely familiar with. You have a method, initialize connection, it takes volume connector, it does some things, and it returns a dictionary. And the whole contract of that is basically this comment. So read the comment and don't mess it up is kind of the plan. If you use type annotations, well, you now have a tool that will let you embed this information in the code. So on parameters like volume, I messed up the colors here, so this is confusing. But the volume parameter is a type objects.volume, which is our Cinder objects. The connector parameter, which should have been in black, is a dictionary. And the arrow means that this method returns a dictionary. So this information is not used by Python when you're running the code, but you can run tooling against it that can detect issues, and it's also kind of a form of documentation. So if we run PyPy is the tool used for this. So this thing was supposed to just return a dictionary, which is what it did before. So let's say we mess up and we return a tuple of the dictionary and a Boolean instead. We've already described this as returns a dictionary. So you can run MyPy and it will tell you you messed up. You said you were going to return a dictionary, you returned a tuple. And the cool thing about this is that this happens without writing any unit tests. This is just based on the code itself. So thinking about the coverage discussion, all these files that have 50% unit test coverage, we have a chance to shake problems out without having to actually write unit tests if we are applying the type annotations to those. This is kind of the general idea of what we're dealing with. And also feel free to interrupt and ask questions if you want. I don't want to just like bore everybody. And there's a lot of tricky details involved in this. So definitely interrupt me if you want to. I'm going to go through a few more scenarios of how this works, basically. The MyPy tooling, even without adding annotations, will catch some errors that you might make. If you make a variable integer and then in the same method you give it a string later, it will tell you add an int into the string. Python, sure, you can do that. It usually means you're writing kind of not very good code. If you have a case where you really want to do it, you can tell it that and it will let you do it. But I'm pretty sure almost any time you do this, it's probably just an error. But some syntax things, and again, this is part of the Python 3 language at this point. This isn't like a weird add-on kind of thing. But basically with variables or parameters, you have a colon and you can give it a type. So you can say A is an integer, A is an integer. Generally, you wouldn't do this because it would already have known that 3 was an integer and assigned the type to A. But you can declare optional integer. So anywhere you see ty in here, the convention that I grabbed and ran with was to just do import typing, which is a Python standard library. Import typing as ty, so you don't have to type the word typing 100 times through every piece of code. So you can declare A as an integer, and if it's optional, it can be an integer or it could be none. Up here, if you just said int, it would throw an error if it detected that it was going to become none at some point. If you don't know if it's an integer or a string, again, this is probably you're writing not wonderful code. You can say it can be a union, int, or string, and then it'll let it be either one, and it'll keep track of the fact that it could be either one. This is likely to show up a lot when trying to apply this to existing Cinder code, because we have a whole bunch of Cinder code written over a bunch of years by a bunch of different people, and things don't always line up perfectly because years ago when somebody wrote it, they weren't thinking about stuff like this. So there's flexibility here to make it go with whatever you currently have, as opposed to trying to write brand new perfect code. You can get into more complex things. All 3 examples on this slide are basically various ways you could have typed the same variable. You could just say it's a dictionary, and then it knows it's a dictionary. You could say it's a dictionary, and it's a dictionary of strings and dicts. Or you could say it's a dictionary with string keys, and then each value is a dict, and it also has strings and string keys and values inside of that. How far you want to go with that is kind of a judgment between how much effort you want to put into this versus the benefit and likelihood that some code later is going to try to, put an integer here 2 layers down kind of thing. And I think as we work with this a little bit, we'll probably get a better sense of what the best practices might be for how to make this useful and not too cumbersome. Yeah, so I went through a bunch of code doing this to learn how this works and get it up and running. And I will submit some patches probably later today for people who want to look over it. But that went in the LVM driver and said context parameter is a context request context. You have a volume parameter, another volume parameter, a status string, and this returns a dictionary with strings in it that could be none. This was in the LVM driver somewhere. I wouldn't necessarily say that you want to just go do this everywhere, but this is just one place I decided. This was to say data, which if you recognize this is the volume stats stuff that comes out of the driver. You can say it's a dictionary with string keys, and those might have strings or lists. And then if you go down here later and say data 3, yeah, okay, this example is not even wrong in the way that I meant for it to be wrong. It's wrong in a whole different way, but it detected it. So yeah. No, it is. Okay. I'm just forgetting how Python works again. Anyway, since integer is not in the string or list union, or nope, since integer is not a string, it basically says you can't do that because it's supposed to be a string as defined by the key type for the dictionary type. Is this making any sense? I don't know if everybody is left because I can't see blue jeans.
Yeah, no, it's good. Keep going.
Okay.
It's a clear example.
Yeah.
So, method parameters, I found a copy volume and said, source is a string, depth is a string, size is an integer. In this case, block size could have been a string or an integer because that's just how it works currently. So you can tell it that and fine. And it returns none. So I did that, and then I went somewhere and tried to write some bad code to show how this works. So if you have copy volume and it's known to return none, you can go when you run mypy against mydriver.py, which calls volume utils.copyVolume, which is where this came from. It's known that it returns none, and so since my driver's method is stated to return an integer and it says return the value of copy volume, it'll throw an error saying it doesn't return a value, so it can't give you an integer. And I don't know, I love this because we have fixed a whole bunch of bugs in Cinder like this over the years, because the only way you catch this normally is either at runtime or if you wrote good enough unit tests. So there's definitely some things to shake out like this in real code. And I found one or two problems, but I'm trying to stick to not super complicated for now. Kind of practical things. How do you tell this tool to quit complaining? This is another thing that will come up as you try to apply this to a large pre-existing code base. Maybe the code does some fishy things, but it works and you just want to leave it that way. You can use a comment that says type ignore for most of these checks. This one actually came up in the remote FS or NFS code, where we have self.nova is an instance of the compute class, and when the driver starts, it's none, and when the driver is initialized, it's the none is replaced with an instance of Nova's API or the compute Nova API class in Cinder. So the tooling will complain, hey, this might be none. The delete volume snapshot might not be a method because this could be none, and it says it's not happy. So you could do a type ignore. You can also do an actual just assert, and you can just assert it's not none, and it will, at the check time, it'll use this information and believe you, and then say, okay, then it's fine. This is another one of those things of whether you want to use a type comment, whether you want to use an assertion, or this other option on the next page, just comes down to, I don't know. We need to figure out the best practices around this, because this obviously is a comment. This does nothing at runtime. Assert will actually do something at runtime, but if that assertion failed at runtime, you were going to fail on the next line anyway. So it's not, it's not like it's worse, but it has a runtime impact. And you get a different exception. You'll get like an assertion error instead of a value error or whatever you get out of the other one. The other option is this came up in the encryption key manager stuff, where we're cloning or creating encryption keys, and we call out to a Cinder key manager class, which eventually calls out to Castellan to create a key for us. And this is not the message that you actually get, but this is Eric's interpretation of the message was basically MyPy doesn't know what key manager is doing because it's in a whole nother library and it hasn't been annotated and it could be doing anything. But you have the option to say, I think this was, okay, well, you have the option to do a cast basically where you say, this is a string, just believe me, it's a string, and go with it. This was supposed to say cast string, comma, key ID, I think, instead of encryption key ID. It's actually supposed to be the parameter being returned was the point. But that's the other way, that when you have existing code that's kind of hasn't had all this stuff figured out yet, you can just leave it alone and say, just go with it. It's all right. So one of the bugs I found in the remote FS code, I didn't spend a lot of time looking at the impact of this. And I also have not been a good Cinder citizen and actually wrote a bug report yet, which I guess I will do later today. But one of the problems I actually found was this MyPy reports error too few arguments for QEMU image info in this call. And there's 3 or 4 different definitions of this method. They all take at least 2 parameters. So this is actually broken, which is just, you know, I spent 10 minutes putting some annotations in the remote FS code and it shook out this already. So it's nice to see that it does stuff. So I'll submit a patch later today to get this off the ground. There's going to be a MyPy environment in Tox is how you run this. And there's a text file that as people annotate code, you can add Python files to MyPy files.txt to tell it which ones to run on, rather than it trying to run on the whole tree and not really doing much. I just stole the infrastructure for the Tox environment and the script around that from Nova, because a nice Nova developer did this recently and it looked great. So I'm going to take it and run with it for Cinder. Yeah, I mentioned most of the caveats already. It's a lot of work to just go retrofit this into all of Cinder. I think the general concept of retrofitting it into Cinder is a good idea, but it's not like somebody's going to just do this next week. And we'll have to kind of get some best practices around how to do this in a way that's most useful without being too cumbersome and annoying. Having 80 character line length limit stinks because all your parameters have types on them and nothing fits in 80 characters anymore. So a lot of method definitions are probably going to have a vertical list of parameters instead of a horizontal list now. And mix-ins are a whole bucket of worms that I have not figured out yet with this. We don't have a lot of them, but we do have a few of them in Cinder. I'm going to mostly ignore that for the moment and start with easier parts of this and figure that part out later. This is a very long slide. Anyway, plan. I'm going to get the infrastructure up and running where people can actually run this thing. I think it's kind of up to whoever wants to do this, where they might want to do it in Cinder. Obviously, you know, code that's high impact core code that's used by everybody is maybe a more useful place to start with, but maybe driver maintainers just want to do their driver. I don't know. I don't have a lot of recommendations other than either do what would be very useful or do whatever you want to do just for fun with it. I think either one's probably fine. I did find while I was doing this that it definitely will help call out code that's just poorly structured and probably needs to be refactored a bit. So that's probably going to be an outcome of this, is it's going to point out to anybody doing this, like, hey, this giant method I have is really just a mess and I need to restructure it a bit. And the end goal, of course, is fewer bugs, because we can detect bugs more easily than with any tools that we have currently for at least some of these bugs. And once we kind of get up and running with this, we'll have to look at what our dependencies are doing with it. I mean, in my opinion, this is basically the future of a lot of Python code. So I think there's going to be a pretty good pickup of this concept in general. I think a little bit of work has started in Oslo already. But obviously, if libraries that we import do this, it gives us better coverage for Cinder and for our project. I don't know if there's really any kind of OpenStack-wide concerted effort around coordinating this, but I think that's fine for now. I think we probably should just start going with it and see where we end up. Couple links. I would not recommend trying to use my presentation as a thorough class on how all this works. There's MyPy documentation. Their cheat sheet stuff is really good. Python 3 itself has a lot of more verbose documentation on how this works. There's a set of Nova patches, which is a good starting point as well. And I will submit mine later today and make this an actual link that goes to some Cinder stuff. So I don't know. Is this terrifying? Is it great? I don't really know what people think. I think it's awesome. I'm hoping other people think it's awesome.
I think it's really good, and it's probably going to help driver development since we don't have the best of documentation in the interface. Sometimes it's hard to know what the driver is getting. Is it getting a version object, an ORM instance, a dictionary? I just recently, I thought we were passing always version objects to the drivers, and just recently I found that in some detach operation, suddenly we end up passing, I think it was an ORM instance or something like that, or a dictionary, which we shouldn't. And with this, I think it will help not only driver developers know what they get, but also us make sure that we are passing the right things from the Cinder code. Yeah.
Yes, I agree with Gorga. It could be extremely useful sometimes, especially for some driver APIs and for some internal Cinder API, like Volume Manager API or something like it, Scheduler API. But I'm against to rewrite all the code using MyPy right now because it will lead to a lot of patches with just adding type annotations without any real benefits for us. For example, if somebody adds annotation to some driver and that's all, not really useful at this time. Of course, in the future, it will be good to have type annotation for the whole project, maybe, I don't know. But for now, I would prefer to have annotations only for specified models.
I think it makes sense to use the type annotations where the developer thinks it makes sense on a patch. I'm thinking of a patch I've got up that I'm going to rewrite now because I was sloppy in the unit tests. It's supposed to get an object, and I faked it with a string because it was faster and it was easier to do the test. I'm going to go back and change that. And I think I agree with you. I don't want to see like 100 patches just adding this stuff everywhere like you see every so often when there's an effort. But I think if we each do it where it makes sense and start to get used to it, I think it'll be a lot of help. I'm thinking like with Rajat's work on the, he did all that work to make sure that we always have a volume type for everything. So we could, having methods where we know it's supposed to return something in particular and never none, and being able to say that is pretty cool. So I think we can make, so I like that once Eric gets the infrastructure in place, I like that it's part of the Python language, so we don't have to worry about adding a whole bunch of tooling that's suddenly going to change. So that's good. And I think we can have some impact. So I think that the main thing is, I agree with Ivan, let's use it where it makes sense now and start to get used to it. And then once we understand better how we're doing it, then maybe we can have a project where we go through and just start adding it to stuff.
Well, I
So
think
I
what you're
like
going
this.
to find is that you're going to go try to add it to one important spot. And then for that to be useful, you're going to need to add it to the code around that. And, you know, you're not going to be able to avoid just adding it to quite a lot of code if you want it to be useful. But fortunately,
Well,
yeah.
sorry, I just wanted to mention that there are two types of useful. One is for developers looking at the code, and the other is for automation tools. So even if we start adding to very specific portions of it, it would still be useful for developers looking at the code and saying, oh, so this is what this method gets. It's not as good as the whole thing, but yeah.
So I think Liang had a question in the chat about is it possible we could add bugs by doing this?
I think it's unlikely. I mean, you certainly could, but most of this is basically documentation kind of changes. I mean, it's Python code, but it doesn't do anything at runtime. So you could introduce bugs in like the scenario I mentioned, where if you start going and adding an assert statement, well, I mean, if that breaks, the code was probably broken already. It's certainly possible to add bugs with this, but most of it's pretty low risk, because just adding a bunch of, you know, method arrow returns type X, like there's nothing that happens where that's going to produce a bug. And that's true for most of this stuff. I mean, programmers are creative. We can break anything eventually, but for the most part, since it's not actual live code, it's not going to introduce behavioral changes.
I find it very useful and interesting, but I have another concern that once we start using the typing annotations, and after that we find a bug that should be backported to a stable branch that does not support Python 3. So we should plan a flow for creating another patch for Python 2 stable branches.
Yeah, it's certainly a concern. The answer in general is going to be when you're backporting a patch in that scenario and it has this type of annotation information in it, we're going to have to just delete it if it's going back to a branch that doesn't support that. So I think you can do this on at least Python 3.5 and forward. I don't remember exactly. But yeah, that's certainly a thing that will come up somewhere.
And we also should take care about driver's code, because last PTG we agreed that we will not remove 6 from driver's code in general, and we agreed that driver's code should be Python 2 compatible as long as we can. So we should document somewhere our policy about type annotations and drivers.
I don't know how we've decided to make drivers remain Python 2 compatible. We don't even run Python 2 unit tests against them.
Yes, we just decided to try to avoid some obvious patches with Python 3 only syntax.
Well,
that's why we didn't remove 6 and so on.
I'm not terribly inclined to avoid using Python 3 tooling because of Python 2 concerns. I mean, at some point, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you. We're going to have a point where we move on. We can't be stuck with 2 forever. And if we have to modify patches when we backport them, then we have to modify them. There's no big deal with doing that.
Well, submitted a bunch of patches for the stuff that I poked at while learning this. It's all very much incomplete and kind of Eric's adventure of just fiddling around implementing this thing. So definitely don't think that any of this is like recommended to be merged, but it gives you something to look at and play with if you're interested in this.
Okay, so Yvonne brings up a good point. We should probably revisit this. So I just pasted the transition guidelines that we agreed on last PTG. So let's take a look and see what we're thinking.
Yes, I am all for using new features from Python 3. I am all for using type annotation where it brings a lot of sense. I do understand that we can get some troubles during backports, but we've got different policies for JavaScript and we have to follow it.
Well, as somebody that deals with a whole bunch of backports, I would rather have to manipulate backport patches than not start using this kind of tooling personally.
Just kind of a random note. So I'm relatively new to the Cinder like development stuff, and I will say that adding type hints definitely would help with like the learning curve a lot. I can definitely confirm that. So like one thing I started doing is I'd add type hints just while I'm writing some new code and then remove them at the ends. That way it just kind of helps with like if you use an IDE, it kind of helps with some of the suggestions. But then if you just remove it before you merge it, you still get some of the benefits of just making it a bit easier to understand for the newcomer side, at least. Just kind of my 2 cents from what I noticed.
Yeah, I'm sure anything that can provide more info about the driver interface for sure would be handy. Because looking at it for the first time, I'm sure it's a lot to figure out.
All right, so let's look at the transition guidelines and see if we still agree on all this. So we want new code to have excellent coverage. I think we still agree about that. Right. So we're allowing drivers to use 6 at their discretion, and we won't remove 6 from mainline Cinder code impacting drivers. Do we want to pull back on that in this release and remove 6? I mean, the main point for keeping it was just mostly for convenience of backporting driver fixes. But if we're, willing to consider a new patch, right? Because Ussuri's Python 3 only. So it's only stuff that's going to, right, Stein and train at this point. And I guess Rocky and Queens, and Okada and Pike.
Is there a reason to put effort into removing it right now?
No, I'm not saying we should put effort into removing it, but it's a question of so we made a commitment that we won't. but I think, right, starting to use more Python 3 only type features. I guess the point is, like Lucio brought up, if we're going to start adding Python 3 only features, then we might as well start thinking about not using 6 in mainline code.
I would just say that as far as concerns about backporting things, having good unit tests is going to be pretty critical if you're crossing the Python 3 to 2 line on backports.
So what's our feeling about new driver code using 6?
Why would new driver code use it? Really?
Well, it's mostly so you can just backport the change directly.
I mean, have we seen any patches recently with new driver code using 6? I don't think I have, but I may not be the best example at the moment.
We've got some patches with 6 to driver's code last cycle. Okay. I don't have anything by the hand, but I did review some of them. Also, I remember that I did review 6 removal from driver. I put +2 on that particular patch because it was done by driver maintainer.
Okay.
So if driver maintainer wants to remove 6, okay.
Right.
Brian, when you're saying new driver code, you mean new code for existing drivers, not code for new drivers, right?
Right. Yeah, because the new drivers.
I think we had one new driver proposed that wanted to have 6 because they were trying to use it for their downstream out of tree driver that they had been using and now trying to get into Cinder.
And also sometimes that if people are not involved in upstream development, they just are looking on the existing drivers and do some copy paste.
Yeah.
And they use 6 in new code.
That's probably true.
All right, let me, I'll put up a patch revising this. And then we can, we'll have something specific to look at. But it seems like we should go more to, yeah, we want to take advantage of Python 3, I think. That's our main focus now. All right. Okay, any other observations or questions or anything about this? It's like not. Let's take a short break since we haven't. So it's 14:36. So let's pick up again at 14:45. Give you like 5 minutes. Okay, great. I'm going to stop the recording and start again later. All right, thanks. See you at 14:45.